Welcome back, everybody. Glad that you're here today with us. The format for today is we're going to go over the answers for the exercise, and then we're going to turn it over and answer any questions that you have. So if you go ahead in the Q&A box, you can type your answers. And if there's anything that came up yesterday that we didn't have an opportunity to go over from the questions, we can review that. Or if there's any concepts that you just need explained again, please feel free to put that in the Q&A as well. So we have a lot of time together this afternoon to hopefully answer all the questions. And I'm going to be going back and forth in between the exercise document and the slides. And on the exercise document, if I'm on a question that you can't see on the screen, you're going to want to take your cursor, and there should be a gray bar on the right side of the document, and you're going to have to scroll down. So if I scroll down, it doesn't change what you see on the screen, so you're going to have to scroll down in order to see the different questions. So let's get started. The first question is, how do HUD lead-based paint regulations work in tandem with CDC and EPA, and can we give some examples? So the first one I'd like to talk about is the Childhood Lead Poisoning Prevention Program. So let's look at slide 18. Open my thing here. Okay, so we have HUD, if you see down below here about the different trigger levels. So right now, HUD is using the confirmed blood lead level of 5 micrograms per deciliter, while the CDC recently lowered their reference value to 3.5 micrograms per deciliter. And so HUD is going to continue to take action for confirmed blood lead levels at 5 micrograms per deciliter at this time. But that could change, so you want to watch to see if there's any updates. But that's, they're watching that. CDC did lower theirs, but HUD is keeping theirs at 5 right now. And then let's look at how we work with EPA. So I'm going to go to slide 23. Remember this slide, we went over the different regulations. So we have, with EPA, our Subpart F, that's the lead disclosure rule. So that's the same as our Subpart A that we have. We have our D, L, and Q. That's our lead-based paint activities. Our lead-based paint activities rule, remember that was the WHO, the standards for performing the lead abatement, and that is in alignment with Subpart L, because L was what the rules were, and then the D, L, and Q for EPA was WHO. What are the standards for performing the lead abatement, a risk assessment, inspections, that type of thing. And then we have our E and Q, which is the renovation, repair, and painting rule, and this is applying to all target housing, public and private, built before 1978, including child-occupied facilities, schools, and daycare facilities, even though HUD's rules are really just focusing on housing. And it revises thresholds for testing dust and paint. The HUD rules defer to EPA for those numbers, so those go into immediate effect if those numbers change for dust levels. All right, let's go back to our exercise, and let's look at question number 2. What projects or units must comply with lead-safe housing rule and are subject to federal and EPA and HUD enforcement actions regarding lead-based paint? So this is really, all housing that's built before 1978, HUD-assisted housing built before 1978 without the exemptions is what we're really looking at for the lead-safe housing rule. I want to go to slide 31 to talk about who's all responsible. We talked about this a little bit yesterday, where the PHAs and property managers and their maintenance employees are going to be subject to federal enforcement actions regarding compliance with the federal lead-based paint regulations. And then this slide was also really focusing on RRP, the renovation, repair, and painting rule as well. We talked about a lot of different roles and who, what the different roles could be played. We have our program staff. We have our lead specialists as well. And so our lead specialists usually hired out. You can have your risk assessors, your paint inspectors, clearance examiners, and then for any work that needs to be done, whether it's abatement or interim controls, we would have our lead abatement supervisors, our RRP workers, certified or trained lead contractors. All right, let's go look at question number 3. What are the types of vendors or contractors and their qualifications that a PHA should have available to them on call, and what will they be doing? So I want to go to our worker handout here. Remember, we were going to have to do visual assessments. Visual assessments are something that was done at unit turnover, and then every year, the first year after work was done, and then the third year, and then if 2 consecutive risk assessments didn't have any additional issues, then it would be every year after that. So a visual assessor is going to be needed. That could be someone on staff. They could take that free online training, but you would definitely want to have available to you visual assessors. And then we would also want to have available to us risk assessors who are going to be conducting those certified risk assessments. You might also want a lead-based paint inspector who would inspect and test all the painted surfaces. If any work needs to be done, you might need a dust sampling technician who could do clearance. Our risk assessors and our lead-based paint inspectors can also do clearance as well. And then if any work needs to be happening, we would want to be doing abatement. So we'd have abatement contractors, firms, supervisors, and workers. If we end up having to do interim controls because we don't have capital improvements funding, we would have our RP certified contractors, firms, and renovators. Abatement contractors, firms, supervisors, and workers could also undertake interim controls as well. And then to do clearance, we would have a lead-based paint risk assessor or a certified lead-based paint inspector or a lead sampling technician. All right, let's look at question number 4. List the key steps and the documents that the owner, the PHA, has to implement to ensure that the units are in compliance. So I always think it's helpful to look at the summary chart, and that's, I think, on slide 33. So the summary chart is usually where I go to try to help me remember what are all the steps that I need to follow. So we start here. The first thing is disclosure. So we talked about disclosure on slide 36. So remember, the PHA is providing a signed and dated disclosure form where they're letting them know whether they know if there's lead in the unit or not, what any work that's been done, or if they don't know. They're providing that blue Protect Your Family from Lead in Your Home pamphlet, and they're also providing instructions to the tenant on who to notify when they identify any deteriorated paint. So disclosure is where we're starting, and then we're going to be looking. That's our different types of evaluations that are going to take place. So there's going to be a lead inspection and a risk assessment. And that's being done to determine if there's any lead hazards, where they are, what needs to be done to address them. So we would have the report of the lead inspection and the risk assessment, and then we would have a lead hazard evaluation notice that would be provided to the occupants. I had a copy of the notice here somewhere. Nope, must have been later on. All right, and then we get into treating. If there were lead hazards identified, what was the treatment that was going to be done? So that was either going to be abatement or interim controls. So we would want to have certification of the personnel who were completing the hazard reduction. We'd want to have acknowledgement that the RRP pamphlet was handed out. We would have a statement or specifications of work that includes lead safe work practices for interim controls and hazard abatement, in addition to any maintenance repair activities. We would have a post-work checklist for hazard reduction activities. If there was any occupant protection, we would have documentation about that, as well as if there had to be any temporary relocation. And then we were getting into clearance. So clearance, we would have certification of the personnel who completed the clearance report. We would then be doing notification, so we're telling, and we would have that notice of lead hazard reduction activities, as well as any additional a disclosure notice. If there had been additional work done, then that disclosure notice needs to be updated. And then we'd be getting into ongoing maintenance, where we would have reports of any new evaluations. We would have reports of any new hazard reduction that might be identified, a clearance report, certification of all personnel who would complete that work, and then another updated disclosure notice if that's required. So the last question is, how do you know if your organization is ready to meet compliance? Well, coming to these trainings is a good start, so you actually understand what the requirements are, how you're going to apply them. If you think about your program now, are there any gaps that you need to address? Is there any things you need to change for your policies and procedures? So having policies and procedures, having a plan on how you're going to do ongoing maintenance, how you're going to respond if you have a child with an elevated blood level. Also, perhaps having a list of certified workers available to you. If you recall, when we went over EBLL, there were some really quick turnaround deadlines that need to be met. So having a list of a risk assessor, people who can do the work, clearance technicians, having that available to you will help you meet that compliance. All right, so let's go into our scenario. So this is, we have a unit that's turning over in the City Public Housing Agency, and the property was built in 1960. So the City Public Housing Agency confirmed that there are records of a lead-based paint inspection and a risk assessment on file from 2002, and the records show that abatement was conducted, but there is not a record that the unit is lead-free. What steps must be completed before the new family can move in? So I have us going to the slides, and I was going to start us on 47. Remember, Les went over this chart with us. And so we know our situation is that we have one on file, but it's not certified as lead-free. So it looks like it's the second arrow down here. So our next step, or what we need to do, is a visual assessment required at unit turnover. So that's where we are right now. We're at unit turnover, and so we are going to do a visual assessment. And during that visual assessment, the inspector identifies deteriorated paint, paint chips, and other debris. And so he's going to have a record of that if he identifies that. He's going to have a record of the visual assessment. If for some reason that the inspector goes through and doesn't find any deteriorated paint and it passes the visual assessment, then the family can move in. Notification is not needed. The family would receive the disclosure notice about any previous knowledge of lead of the unit in the common areas and any records. So if it did pass, we don't have to do any work. They can just get the disclosure notice and any records. Let's pretend in this scenario it didn't pass and we do find some deteriorated paint. So then what do we need to do? Well, I always like to go back to my summary. So if it failed the visual assessment, we're going to do a risk assessment. So we're going to do a risk assessment, see where the hazards are, provide the notice of lead hazard evaluation. After that was done, we're going to be completing interim controls, and then we'll get to our clearance. It'll hopefully pass clearance, and we will then provide a notice of lead hazard reduction activities. We also want to be determining if there's a child under the age of 6 residing in there, because we want to have that for our records in case we ever have a situation where there's an EBLL child in the property. Because remember, if there's a child under 6 living in the unit, that could become one of my other coverage units. So I want to be able to track that. We did provide some resources about how to do that. And then after this unit passed clearance, we are going back into our ongoing maintenance. So remember, for our ongoing maintenance, that first year, we were doing first year after the work was done, we're doing a visual assessment to check for failure of lead hazard reduction work or any defective paint. That second year after the work, a risk assessment is being done. The third year, we're back to a visual assessment. The fourth year, we're doing another risk assessment. If there's no deterioration occurs, then we're allowed to do visual assessments moving forward. And then we're making sure that we're keeping records. We're having copies of all the work that was done. The workers do need to be certified using RRP, and we're keeping our records for that. And then I also just wanted to show you again our resources that start on page 101, and we can go over these again after the questions, but we had our landing page for the resources, the toolkit. The toolkit was updated to include Subpart L. You don't see it in the screenshot, but it's really there. It was finished at the end of October, so we're really excited about having that available to you to use for Subpart L as well. And then our videos, the HUD guidelines, also really helpful for you as well, and the mailing list where you can go and put your name on that, and then you don't have to search for new updates. That information is pushed out to you, so that helps make your job a little easier, because I know everybody's trying to keep track of all the different changes and when things happen. So being on that mailing list will help ensure that you'll get the information as it comes out through the HUD exchange. So Les, is there any questions that have come up from the exercise, or anything that you want to expand on a little more?
Well, the only question that's come up, and this is kind of good that you're right about where you are, I think if you go back to maybe slide 100 or 101, it's our first, I think on the, probably on the toolkit page. So the question was about, okay, you showed me the disclosure, the picture of that, but where do I actually find the form? So Barrett sent out a link in the chat, but I'm going to guess, and that was for the EPA site, but I'm going to guess that in the toolkit, the materials that need to be provided as part of disclosure are probably available in the toolkit also?
Yeah, they are. Probably under the basics.
Yeah, okay. And then we've just gotten a question in about asking about for abatement activities. And we talked about the fact that with abatement activities, we're not necessarily removing all of the lead paint. We could be doing some kind of encapsulation, but it has to have a 20-year lifespan. And so there was a question about, are there required steps that the PHA needs to take at the end of that 20-year period? So if it was done in 2003, is there anything that must happen that year besides the visual inspection? Well, this is sort of the minimum lifespan for that abatement work, but really that's the purpose of your ongoing visual assessments, is to make sure that they continue to be intact and that they are functioning. So I don't believe there's any additional, because that it's the 20-year mark, and so we now consider those to have expired. But we're going to continue with our visual assessment to ensure that if we begin to see, we're now past the life expectancy of that abatement, if we begin to see signs that it is no longer functioning the way it was supposed to, then we will take the appropriate action based on that.
Great. So Les, I gave you control if you want to move the slides too.
Yeah, I think you're on the perfect slide for this. Let's see. And the other thing I would just mention, and we kind of been talking about this, it's obviously to your benefit as a manager, owner of a public housing unit, that if you can do abatement, it should then control long-term or the lead hazard, so that you would expect that you're not going to see issues as you're doing your ongoing visual assessments. But if you're able to do full abatement where you actually remove those components, so for instance, we did a training at one point with public housing agencies. One of the folks in the group said, well, we had a risk assessment done for our property, and we determined that the only lead that we had was in the front doors on their units. They went ahead and replaced all of those doors, and they now then had a property that was certified as lead-free. And so that allowed them to then be exempted from these requirements. So obviously, if you can get to the lead-free status, that would simplify your ongoing responsibilities. But certainly, being able to do abatement where you have a 20-year life expectancy on those treatments should also control better those potential exposures as time goes on. I had to read all this. Let me go back to the Q&A and see if we've gotten. Yeah, Karen points out an important point, and I was going to look to see what slide we covered that. I think it's on our evaluation slide. Unfortunately, the form I have in front of me doesn't have numbers, so let's try. See where we are. Okay, here we are. So this is a slide that we were kind of looking at yesterday on, okay, what's that with evaluation? The starting point here is this expectation that you already have a lead inspection and risk assessment that are in place, that were done when the Lead Safe Housing Rule came out. And so I kind of think the first action step here on thinking about evaluation is to make sure that you actually have that original lead-based paint inspection in place. Also, with that file documentation, if your property has had abatement work completed, also making sure that within your files you have that documentation. So in some cases, some of you are going to have the documentation in place to show that once that inspection and risk assessment was done, that you've actually done abatement, and you either have these abatement controls in place that should have a life expectancy of 20 years, or some of you will find that we now have a certified lead-free property. So I think it's really important to make sure all of that is in the file, and that's going to be needed ongoing. So as Chris walked us through on the disclosure process, we're providing that disclosure of what we know about that property, about that unit that people are considering renting. So making sure that you've got a good file system that captures that information, holds on to it, so that you have that information in place is going to be important for you. Chris, we don't really have from yesterday, I think, other questions that probably need to go back over. You talked already about covered units and talking about when we are doing an environmental investigation, when we have a child with an elevated blood lead level. That was really the only question that I had highlighted on our really short list from yesterday. I will just
it was very short, I agree.
mention, so you showed, let's see, we want that. You showed this chart about the level of certification that needed to be in place. So I think this is part of the thinking about in advance that planning about the skill sets and certifications that need to be in place. And that would be part of, if I'm going to do an RFP or maybe I'm going to, my plan is to have staff do visual assessments. I've identified either I have somebody already that has that certification in place, or you need to get that. You've determined that you're going to have a couple of staff members that are going to take the visual assessment training, have that certification, so that you're going to be sure that, yes, I've got somebody that's able to handle that workload, get it done in a timely manner. So I do think kind of looking back at this and doing some pre-planning and thinking about the potential need for certain kinds of work to be done, and have identified what that process will be, whether you're going to do some training, whether you're going to work with community partners to have them get training and certification, or maybe doing steps like having a pre-certified list of contractors, or going through procurement to have folks available for those steps. Have anything else here? Other.
Yeah, I put in the chat for folks to go in the Q&A box if they had any questions, but I haven't seen any new ones come in quite yet. Maybe let's show that slide that has the email again.
Yeah, that's where I was heading back to. Hold on. Go back to the slides and get us to that.
That's one of the last.
Yeah, here we go.
Or the one after that, right? Where it has the email.
Yeah, you're right. Here we go.
There we go.
So we wanted to point out, and we mentioned this the other day, that if you have questions going forward, here is the email that you can submit questions, ask for additional guidance. So I suggested kind of holding on to that, having it available for future reference on that. We did mention that these trainings are being posted, and I don't know if the H&M have been posted yet. There's a little delay on getting them formatted and ready to be able to be posted, but those will be posted on the HUD Exchange, will be available for you. So, as you have staff turnover, you need to go back and use that as a reference. Those will all be available for you on the HUD Exchange.
And the ones that we did last year are already posted on there. So if the ones we did last week aren't ready yet, the ones we did last year are, and it's the same information.
In fact, I think there's, so we have a go-to spot for where you would find trainings that have been posted. If we'll be here just a little bit here. If we don't have additional questions, we just may end our session early and give you back a little bit time in your day. I would just mention Chris did a very quick job on going through the EBLL. Chris, I'm trying to see what slide number that is.
It's 92.
Okay, there we go. But I'll just mention that I think in being prepared to be able to properly address when you have a child with an elevated blood lead level, that you probably need the more extensive training. Chris gave a great overview on this, but I would recommend that if you don't have someone on your staff that has taken this training and is sort of the designated person who will lead those efforts, that you think about making sure that someone on the staff has gone through this and remains up to speed on this. And because of these timelines on the responses, it is kind of important to have done some pre-planning on thinking about how you're going to meet these time requirements. So I would recommend kind of taking into consideration having a process in place and kind of a plan, including staffing for that.
Les, I don't see any more questions.
Yeah. I think we'll, given that we've kind of paused a little bit here and killed some time, I think we'll go ahead and end today's session. I would encourage you to use the resources that we've pointed out, to use the contact information that we provided for future questions on this. And thank everybody for your participation, to Chris, my co-trainer, and also to HUD staff who were helping us through this. And all of this information will be posted on the HUD Exchange. All right. Thanks, everybody. Have a good day.
Bye.